hundreds of talented developers, epic marketing, massive budgets, the best graphics.
16 times the detail.
You'd think that this would be enough to make AAA gaming a guaranteed success. But you'd be wrong. Hero Shooter Concord was in development for 8 years, was estimated to have cost publisher Sony roughly $400 million to make, though this number is disputed, but was shut down less than 2 months after launch, after which Sony refunded all copies of the game to those who bought them. This means that the company invested millions of dollars for basically zero revenue. Ubisoft's Skull and Bones, which was described by the CEO as the first quadruple-A game, cost an estimated $200 million to make and isn't expected to earn back its development cost. Warner Brothers also lost $200 million due to the failure of Suicide Squad: Kill the Justice League, and this isn't a new thing either. All the way back in 2011, the failure of Homefront likely contributed to publisher THQ going bankrupt. Everyone in gaming media and content creation has their own opinions on why this keeps happening, ranging from nuanced takes about consumer demand and market saturation to games just kinda suck now. But instead of making another opinion piece, I decided to collect some actual data and see what trends I could find. So I spent far more time than is reasonable reading article after article after article, and I ended up with a small data set of 40 games from the last decade and a half that were probably commercial failures, or they had an underwhelming launch and maybe turned a profit later on. The main limitations of this are that I'm relying on news sources to be accurate, and that 40 games is still a really small sample size for data analysis, but in fairness, it's not like there are thousands of AAA failures every year to report on in the first place. So here's what I found out. Electronic Arts had the most commercial failures on my list out of any major publisher with 9, including Anthem and Mass Effect Andromeda, but far more worrying than that was Ubisoft's entries on my list that have mostly occurred in 2024. EA might have more underperformances, but they're pretty spread out amongst some hits that did well, where Ubisoft has put out back-to-back misses recently, meaning that the company might be in dire financial straits. Anyway, through this research I found 4 main reasons behind big budget AAA game failures that seem to crop up most often. The main one is that the game was received poorly by audiences, as you'd expect, which is the majority of cases, but other reasons are unrealistic publisher expectations, marketing, and bugs, technical issues, and bad launches. I found that bugs were a major contributing factor to the flop 12 times, or in around 30% of cases. Games where bugs were cited as a major problem in reviews include Mass Effect Andromeda, Medal of Honor Warfighter, and Aliens Colonial Marines. Games can come back from a buggy launch though. Even Fallout 76, despite having one of the worst launches I can remember, likely made profit for Bethesda eventually, despite selling significantly less copies overall than Fallout 4 because of the in-game store. Here's something that's actually less of an issue than I thought it would be. Games where the marketing was a major contributing factor to a game's failure only made up 5 of the 40 games. These include Battlefield 5, where EA president Andrew Wilson admitted that the game's marketing campaign just didn't resonate with the players, and 2016's Hitman. Hitman achieved a Metacritic rating of 84 averaged across all platforms, which suggests it was a pretty good game, but the way it was sold and marketed to the audience was straight up confusing. Hitman was sold in an episodic structure where the game was split into 6 episodes, meaning that the marketing had to be spread thin across all episodes, leaving them without much of a major hype cycle. And this ultimately ended up with publisher Square Enix selling the rights to the game back to developer IO Interactive. If you want to know more about the failure of Hitman, Super Bunny Hop did a good video about it that I'll link to in the description. Some games sold pretty well, but not enough to meet the publisher's expectations or make back the development cost. Battlefield 5 shows up again here. The game sold 7.3 million units and achieved over 100,000 concurrent Steam players, which is the highest out of the games on my list, but this amount still didn't meet EA's expectations, so they decided to stop updating the game after a few months. Perhaps you could rename this category to development too expensive for audience size or something, but I think you get where I'm going with it. The game made money, just not enough of it. Okay, here's the big one. The product itself. roughly 80% of the time, the game design itself was cited by reviewers as being disappointing, for reasons excluding technical issues that were in the other category. Here's a box plot of all the Metacritic scores in the dataset. The median Metacritic score of a multi-million-dollar AAA flop is 65. This doesn't sound too bad until you realise that a lot of consumers only consider 80 plus to be a good score. Really, you can break these games down into two major groups. The 70 plus scorers were usually pretty good games. An example of a game like this would be Evolve. The 4 vs 1 format and harsh learning curve just didn't jive that well with player preferences, which doesn't make it an objectively bad game, it just wasn't something people really wanted. And then there's anything below 70-ish. The high 50s and 60s games are just average or bad in the eyes of consumers, meaning that they will struggle to retain player interest in today's crowded marketplace. Here's another plot showing the distribution of maximum concurrent users reached on Steam of games in this dataset. Sure, some games released on launchers other than Steam, so this data isn't perfect, but even so, there's a very large cluster at the low end of the scale. 7 games didn't even break 1,000 concurrent Steam users, and most didn't break 10,000. This Steam data matches up with the critics' tepid review scores and shows that the reception from consumers was lukewarm at best. Concord from the intro could only muster a peak player count of 697, but despite that, the game itself was nowhere near as objectively bad as that number would suggest. Players just didn't resonate with the characters, the marketing campaign was underwhelming, and it had a box price of $40 compared to its hero shooter competition, which were free to play. A lot of people blamed oversaturation in the hero shooter market for this game's failure, but I don't think this is the whole story, because just 5 months later, Marvel Rivals released and was a resounding success. That game used popular, recognisable characters and was promoted and priced in a way that the hero shooter genre expects. Okay, so we now have a good understanding of the major factors behind AAA game flops: bad launches, poor marketing, high development costs leading to high publisher expectations, and the product itself being kind of mid or just not something consumers were interested in. But surely the studios themselves must be aware of these trends, which begs the question of how and why does this happen? For a small number of the games on this list, information exists about the development processes behind the scenes, and there's one common issue that's brought up frequently: a troubled development cycle, often with periods of high crunch, that's usually caused by a lack of vision amongst what the product should be early on in the development process, or sometimes technical issues later on that force the vision to change too late in the development cycle. Here's a bunch of examples that I found. Duke Nukem Forever was infamously stuck in development hell for several years and was panned when it came out. The original 1.0 version of Final Fantasy XIV had its priorities all over the place and felt unfinished on release. If you want just a single example, at one point flower pots were made up of roughly the same number of polygons as a player character model, which caused performance issues. There was too much emphasis placed on looking good rather than playing good. A lack of vision meant that EA's BioWare struggled for years to understand what kind of game Anthem should be, meaning that the final product that consumers actually got was only put together in the latter half of the development cycle. An article on Kotaku talks about how technical challenges with the Frostbite engine forced BioWare to significantly change their plans for Mass Effect Andromeda partway through development, resulting in most of the game being built in the last 15 months. And according to Tim Kaine, who worked at Carbine, the studio that built shutdown MMO WildStar, internal divisions made the development process of that game tumultuous and prevented the team from having a clear vision of what their game should be. There isn't very much information available about the development processes of most AAA games, especially the ones that fail, because generally companies don't like to talk about that kind of stuff. But from the examples that I could find, the recurring problem seemed to be that dev teams struggled to find a clear vision from the start for one reason or another, or were forced to change their original creative vision due to technical challenges midway through development, ultimately resulting in the final product not really being of the standard they would have wanted to release. Thank you for watching my video. If you found it interesting, subscribe because it helps the channel out and it means you'll see more videos like this one.